In this video I'm going to show you how to attach a button to a granny square fabric. So obviously granny square fabric has got quite a lot of open spaces, and there's not very many stable areas of the fabric where you can safely add a button without it pulling on the fabric, or maybe even you know, the place where you might want to put the button, there might actually physically be a hole, such as at the points where these motifs join. So with this design, this cardigan that I've done for the Scottish Journal of Scottish Yarns, I've actually made like a little piece of facing, I suppose, or a little back piece to help add stability to the fabric in a way that isn't too obvious and sort of blends in with the rest of the fabric of the cardigan. And this is actually on the shoulder seam, because this is a sort of a waterfall opening on the cardigan, and this is where you can pin or close the cardigan across the front of your chest by attaching the corner of the front openings onto these buttons on the shoulder seam. So I'm going to show you the process that I've used to achieve this. So the first thing we need to do is create a bit of stability in the fabric. So as you can see, because this is a really lightweight and open fabric, it's going to be very difficult to put a button anywhere really, because there's literally just nowhere stable to attach the button to. So using the same yarn, I've just created a little disc. So I'm using the main colour yarn and the same size hook, and I've just done a chain 4 and then placed 15 US doubles or 15 UK trebles into a ring and fastened off. Then I've left a nice long tail because I'm going to use that to sew it on. The other thing I've done is I did actually give this a wash in some really hot water, and you can see that it's kind of felted ever so slightly. If at all possible, you want to try and close up this hole in the middle as much as possible, but it's not vitally important. It's just that the more this is like a solid piece of fabric, the better. So you could also cut out a small circle of felt that's not too thick, that's a similar colour to this, or even other kinds of non-fraying fabric. But I've chosen to go for this because I feel that it's quite discreet, and it sort of blends in, doesn't add too much extra weight, and it doesn't change the drape of the fabric too much. And also this is on the shoulder seam, so again that part of the fabric isn't draping as such anyway, and if anything that probably just adds a bit of stability to that shoulder seam anyway. So I've made my little motif. If it's not a fabric if it's a yarn that doesn't felt, then don't worry too much about that. The next step is just making sure I've placed this in the exact spot where I want the button to go. So I'm going to put it on the wrong side of the fabric. You could tack this to the work first before you sew, but I'm just going to go straight ahead and sew this on. So the other thing I want to mention is that I'm not an experienced sewist or needle crafter. This is just my solution to my design, which I thought would be useful. So, you know, I hope I'm not making any experienced sewers make them shout at the screen at what I'm doing, but this works for this design, so you can adapt this to any way that you feel is more professional but anyway. So I found the exact spot where I'm going to put the button backing. I'm on the wrong side of the fabric. I'm going to make sure that the backing for the button is right side facing towards me, because I'm going to be using the stitch loops as my guide for where I'm making the stitches and how many stitches I'm making. So the key bit here is to start off at a point where there are some stitches. So I don't want to be starting off in a gap. I want to make sure that the starting thread is sort of lined up with the next bunch of stitches. And the trick here is that we are not going to be going round entire posts of stitches. We are literally picking up, we're splitting the yarn, we're just picking up little strands. And although this one stitch on its own like this doesn't seem very secure, it's the fact that we're doing 15 of these stitches dispersed around a circumference. So the pull of the fabric is, it's being shared by lots of stitches rather than just one, so it doesn't the pressure of the stitches is shared equally around, so to speak. So we grab a little bit of yarn, try and split the yarn if possible with the cord that's adjacent to the stitch that we want to work, that we're sewing onto, and then we're coming up through the middle of the stitch or just through the back loop of the stitch, because then that also looks really nice and neat. So again, picking up a bit of this 3 double crochet, 3 treble UK 3 treble crochet cluster, and coming up through the middle of the next stitch of this backing piece. Then when I come to a gap, I just ignore that, but the next stitch I am going to work into every single one of these stitches, but the next stitch I'm just going to work into the closest bit of fabric from the back of the cardigan. So, and then even though you've jumped a gap, because of the way we're working this sewing, that's not actually visible, so that's quite nice. And I'm just going to carry on like that all the way around, just catching and splitting threads from the posts of these stitches and popping up through the middle of the stitches on my backing piece. You could also use sewing thread for this, because this is quite a light yarn. It's listed as 4-ply, but really I would say it's more of a 3-ply. So this is not a very thick yarn. I think if you're using a thicker yarn, like a double knit, and you're trying to do this, I think that just adds just too many layers of bulk, and you'd be better off using sewing thread, or even like a lace weight yarn or something. I'm just going to carry on round, snagging a bit of thread from the back, coming up through the middle of the stitch on my backing circle. And just make sure you're not accidentally sewing anything else in. You shouldn't really, because you're not going all the way through to the front anyway. It's always worth double checking. It's quite snaggy, this yarn, because it likes to felt to itself, but it's still manageable. So keep going round, keep going round. Now I've come back to the beginning. So you can see there that that has made a really nice and neat added a bit of substance to that very open area that is going to have a button on it, and then also have another from the button. The weight of the front of the cardigan is going to be hanging off there, so that also helps deal with that without pulling the fabric too much. So I'm just going to go back into the first stitch make a little knot, double knot, 1 knot, 2 knot, and then I'm going to pop in between this disc and the front, so I'm not coming through to the front, I'm just coming inside there, and that's just how I'm going to hide the tail end inside there. Let me just cut that off. Okay, so there we have it. That is now ready for our button. So before you sew the button on, it depends on the design of your piece. If you're making this cardigan, one button goes on the front of the cardigan, and one button is attached to the back because of the way the front flaps are attached. The fronts of the cardigan, one sits on the front, and then the other flap is attached across the chest on the inside. It's on the same spot on the other side, it's just the button needs to go on the inside. So for the example that I'm going to show you, I'm going to sew the button on the right side of the fabric. So next I'm going to show you how I've sewn this button on. So again, I don't claim to be an expert sewist. This is just how I've done it for my cardigan, and it's worked out pretty well. So the first thing is to choose your button, and for this particular design, I didn't really want anything too big or heavy because this is quite a lightweight fabric, so I've gone just for quite a thin natural shell type button. I've also picked a sewing thread that matches the button and the main colour of my work. So the first thing I've done is I've threaded the needle with just some normal sewing thread, some Gutermann. I'm going to start off on the back just to anchor the yarn in, and again, if you are an experienced sewer, you might have a totally different way of doing this. This is actually how I learnt to sew on a button at school, so I still remembered it after all these years. So I'm just going to start off by anchoring the yarn onto the back. I'm just going to let the knot catch and then tie. I've tied 1 knot, I might do 2. Again, this is, I tend to vary from button to button how I do it. So that is secured, and then I'm just going to snip off that end there. And then I'm just going to make like a little cross shape. So I'm making sure I'm not going all the way through the fabric to the front. I'm just going through this backing piece. So I've just made like a little cross hatch. It's just to spread the pressure of the stitches so that it's not all in one spot, because actually the middle of this is a hole as well for this disc. So I'm kind of just trying to make sure that I'm creating a stable base. So you don't need too many, it's just a, you know, a couple of stitches. So then I'm just going to pop through onto the right side at the exact spot where I want to put this button. So when I learnt this method at school, we actually used a matchstick. I don't actually have a matchstick, so I'm using the wool needle I was using before. And this is just, we're going to put that between the button and the fabric, and it's just to add almost like a post, as you get with a crochet stitch, a post to the button attachment, because we don't want the button sitting completely flush to the fabric, because this, you know, does have an element of thickness to it, we need to leave room for the fabric to sit between the button and the fabric of the cardigan. So it's actually better to use a matchstick because it doesn't slip around as much as a button does. But I'm just using that to create that space. I'm going to sew round it. So I'm coming up through one buttonhole, going down through the next, and then just trying to make sure I'm sort of in the middle of that area there. And then I'm just going to do that about 6 times in total, probably. That's 2. You can come back up through the same side. The chances of you undoing your work are pretty slim. What's that, 3? Or is that 4? I can't remember. Call it 4. Call that 5. Really difficult to keep it in the middle of the shot. And call that 6. Okay, just check the back, make sure nothing's gone wrong. Sometimes you can get a couple of loops in that on the back, so you should probably check after every couple of stitches. So now I'm going to sew a couple of stitches here and make a couple of knots, which I do just by making a loop and then going through that loop again. And now I'm going to actually make that post I was talking about. So I'm going to slide out the wool needle or the matchstick, whichever one you've used, and then I'm going to bring the needle up between the button and the front of the fabric, and just make sure I've not left any loops there. And then I'm literally going to wind the yarn round the stitches I've made for the button about 6 times. So what was that? 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Probably did more than 6, but it doesn't matter. So I don't know if you can catch it on the camera, but you can see there I've made like a little, gathered together all those threads and made like a post out of that stitch. And now I need to go back down through the middle to pop up the same spot, and I'm going to fasten off with a couple more knots, and then that's it. So I've just done 1 stitch, and then I'm going to do a loop and a knot, and a loop and a knot. And then the same as I did with the when I was sewing on this actual motif, I'm going to hide the end in between the back bit reinforcement panel and the actual front of the work. Pop up there, snip that off, and then you have got a button that's really stable. You've created a stable area that can support a little bit of weight hanging off there. I think that's a pretty nifty solution, really.